Hello everyone, I'm Jim Deeks, and thanks for joining us on another episode of Canada Files. Our guest on this edition is Bob Rae, currently Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, but for over 40 years, one of our country's most respected career politicians. At one time, the Premier or Governor of Ontario, and later the interim leader of the National Liberal Party. And because of, or in spite of, his left-of-center political philosophy, a man who's been highly regarded by all for his intellect, eloquence, charm, and sense of justice. We caught up with Ambassador Rae in New York City. Ambassador Rae, we know how very busy you are at the UN these days, so we really appreciate your taking the time to join us today.
Jim, it's great to be with you, and I really appreciate your joining us here at our apartment, which is wonderful to welcome you here.
Well, we appreciate being allowed in your living room. Let me start with, of course, the situation in Ukraine. Because of production scheduling, we're recording this interview in early April, and by the time it's broadcast, things may have changed dramatically. But at this point, we're over 6 weeks since the Russians invaded Ukraine. And let me ask, first of all, whether you and your colleagues in the UN think that there is any chance that, considering the destruction we've seen and the genocide we've now seen, that Ukraine will ever again be an independent country?
Oh, I think so. I firmly believe that Ukraine will be an independent country. It is an independent country, and the invasion is terrible. It has no justification. And it is, I think, one of the most blatant acts of aggression by one UN member against another that we've seen since 1945. I mean, there are a few examples over the last 75 years. This is one of the worst and one of the most destructive. But I believe that Ukraine will prevail. I think the Russians have made a terrible mistake. I think they've calculated that they could do something quite quickly. They could destroy Ukraine's independence quickly, and nobody would really notice, and the Americans would not interfere, and the rest of us wouldn't do very much. And I think they underestimated the Ukrainian people. They've underestimated the determination of Western countries, and I think that they've found themselves, as we speak in early April, they found themselves in a terrible situation. We've just heard over the last few days of terrible revelations of what can only be described as atrocities, of people being killed with their arms tied around their back, and we're getting increasing knowledge of how many people are being killed right throughout the country. So I think that this will, I believe, mobilize more and more the Western countries together with Ukraine to say that this is not going to be allowed to take the course that the Russians wanted it to take. So I'm quite confident that ultimately Ukraine will prevail.
At the outset, when the Russians did invade, did you and your colleagues honestly think that the United Nations could have done anything to prevent the invasion or to persuade the Russians to pull back before it got out of hand?
I don't think so, because I don't think the Russians ever really believed that the West would respond in the way that it did. Let's not forget, we did give warnings. President Biden, on behalf of a number of countries, made it very clear that this was going to be there would be a response to an invasion such that Russia had never seen before. I don't think the Russians believed it. I think the Russians thought, I think President Putin thought, that wouldn't happen. However, having said all that, Jim, I have to say that I've always been somebody who, whenever I look back and see something happening or something had happened, I always ask myself the question, what more could we have done? To be perfectly honest, I think we could have given even more of a warning to the Russians, but at the end of the day, I don't think the Russians would have believed it. And the fundamental problem with Ukraine is the Russians do not accept the fact that Ukraine is an independent country. that Ukrainian nationalism is a real thing. It's not a made-up thing. It's not a Nazi invention. It's a sense of country. It's a sense of place, a sense of language and culture, which I think Canadians instinctively understand because there are so many Ukrainians in Canada, and we know the strength of that culture, and we know it's not Russian. We know it's Ukrainian, and I think that that's what gives us as Canadians a particular perspective on what the Ukrainian nationality is all about.
But the fact that the invasion happened and the fact that the UN really hasn't been able to physically stop it from happening, has this situation proven perhaps once and for all that despite the initial objectives of the UN when it was established in 1945, that in fact it's an organization that's basically powerless to stop international conflict?
Well, as an organization, it can't stop international conflict because it doesn't have the means to do so. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have It's not an organization that commands the power to be able to do that. I think that's very clear. I think we really have to always go beyond the name the United Nations and say it's the member states of the United Nations have not been able to stop it. I think sometimes we blame the organization. Richard Holbrooke, who was American ambassador here many years ago, used to say, don't blame Madison Square Gardens every time the Knicks lose. And he was making a point about don't blame the UN every time something goes wrong. Look at the member states and ask yourselves the question, could they be doing more? And that, I think, is the real question. Can we do more? And as we talk at this particular time, we've done a lot. We've done a lot on sanctions. We've done a lot on arming the Ukrainians, giving them the military means to respond. We've done a lot on really trying to pursue this issue of accountability and the way in which we have to hold the Russians accountable for what's taken place. And a lot on the humanitarian side. There's been an extraordinary humanitarian effort to respond to the 11 million Ukrainians that have now been displaced. But it's still not enough. We still haven't stopped the Russians. So I think the fundamental question is, what more can we do to stop the invasion? And I think that has to become much more the central question, because I think that is the central issue.
So let's talk about your role during this whole Ukrainian situation. Canada, as you would well know, has had a reputation for 3 generations at least as a great peacekeeping nation. Do your colleagues in the UN look at you personally and Canada as being a leader in trying to bring about peace in this situation and others, but in this situation as well?
I don't think I can really answer that question. I think we do have a good reputation at the UN. My impression from talking to my colleagues and from talking about our positions on things, I think people are very responsive to it. Not only our traditional allies in NATO and Western Europe and the United States, but also many countries in other parts of the world where they know they've had experience of working with Canada and with Canadians. Many African countries where Canadians have been involved over the years. Canada's reputation is a good one. I think it's always a challenge to live up to your reputation and to make sure that you're walking the talk. And certainly our role here at the UN on Ukraine has been very active. We've been a very active part of the discussions on what steps should be taken to deal with the aggression. We've been very active speaking out on the aggression. And we've been very active in meeting privately and confidentially with a number of major players to talk about what might be done, what more we could do, how we could advance that. So Canada's been very, very engaged, and I personally have been very engaged in all parts of what needs to happen, and will continue to do that.
You know, one of the assumptions that people make about diplomats is that they have to be extremely talented in the skill of understatement, the art of understatement, and polite discretion. But you have been quite outspoken since you arrived at the UN a little over 2 years ago, and in particular in your comments about the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Knowing you, I know that these statements of yours would be coming totally from the heart and from your innate sense of justice. Have you shocked your diplomatic colleagues, in view of the art of understatement, with some of your strong convictions and statements?
I don't know if the word is shocked. I think sometimes some of them are bemused, some of them are amazed, some of them are envious at my determination to speak out, and the fact that so far, as we're speaking, I'm still here, and the government is still letting me do my job, what I think is my job, and I think the government agrees it's important for the world to know where Canada stands. The Prime Minister has been very encouraging to me personally to keep doing what I'm doing. A couple of times he said to me, "That's why you're there," and I do think in today's world, I think there is a time for really communicating directly with people, and I think it's appreciated if we can do that.
Just moving beyond Ukraine, there are, as you well know, other conflicts going on around the world. In Yemen, serious and very, very nasty conflict there. In Myanmar, which you would know from personal experience. But there's one that's looming that I think keeps all of us awake at night, and that is the possible aggression against Taiwan by the Chinese. I'm sure you won't want to speculate on whether or not that will happen, but let me ask this. Can you say if there are talks going on in the UN now to try to exert influence on the Chinese not to go ahead with any aggression against Taiwan?
Yes, I can say there are always quiet conversations that happen among allies, but also with other governments, and certainly with governments in the region, in Asia. It's important I think for Canadians to understand that the Korean conflict has never been fully resolved. We still have a North Korea with nuclear weapons. Japan is obviously a critical regional power, deeply concerned about the situation with North Korea, but also deeply concerned about China and about the possibility of greater conflict there. So I think it's fair to say that one of the things that's true about the UN is that we're very aware that just because something isn't on the news doesn't mean it isn't real or it isn't something that's coming. So whether it's the Middle East, here we are, Jim, it's early April, Easter, Ramadan, and Passover are all taking place simultaneously over the next 10 days. No idea what could or could not happen as a result of that, what the implications of that could be, plus the uncertainty of conflict. I mean, I always remind people in the Americas that if you'd had diplomats sitting around 10 years ago to say, do you think that 6 million refugees will be coming out of Venezuela, they would have said, what are you talking about? I mean, nobody predicted that. Nobody predicted that would happen in the way in which it did happen. And that's an enormous source of instability for all of the Americas to have seen that conflict essentially just blow up out of a condition inside Venezuela. But nobody was really fully apprised as to how serious that was going to be. So we have to keep our eyes and ears open for all conflicts, and we have to keep talking about them. And certainly I do, engaging with a number of, as I said, number of allies, but a number of others too, including the Chinese.
One of the other items that keeps people awake is the fear that China and Russia are becoming closer allied in a closer way, and that might even become more prominent if Russia succeeds in annexing Ukraine. We don't know, of course. Do you believe that outcome is a distinct possibility, that those two countries will get closer together? And if so, what does that mean for the future of democracy when you have sort of the most populous country in the world and one of the strongest and least friendly nations to democracy together?
Well, it's not the first time. I mean, there was a time of rapprochement between Russia and China when they were both communist countries, and then there was a certain falling out and different kinds of relationships over the years. Well, first of all, with respect to the issue of annexing Ukraine, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that the Russians will be allowed to get away with that. I don't think that's going to take place. What I do think, though, is that there could be an alliance, an opportunistic alliance between the two of them. There sort of is already now on a number of issues where you can see at the UN how they work together, and they obviously are linking their approaches on a number of topics at the UN around women's rights, human rights more broadly, democratic rights. Yes. So yes, is it a threat to democracy? Absolutely. Democracy is a highly contested idea in the world today, and I think we, for a while in the post-1990 end of the Berlin Wall, I think there was a sense of triumphalism of the inevitability of the rise of and hegemony of democracy, that it would simply spread and prevail around the world. I think we've all had to come to grips with one simple fact, and that is there's nothing inevitable about anything. Democracy is a wonderful idea. I think it responds to something very deep in the human spirit, but it doesn't mean that the bad guys are going to let it happen. And so we have to be prepared for a battle. It doesn't have to be only a military battle, but it is a battle of ideas, and it certainly requires both, frankly, soft power and hard power. And I think we're having to come to terms with that as Canadians, that we live in a world where there are bad things will happen and bad things will prevail unless we're prepared to fight for what we believe in. And I firmly believe that's true.
Let's talk about more good things. You are probably not the first son of a UN ambassador to be an ambassador to the UN, but your father, Saul Rae, was one of Canada's most distinguished diplomats in the latter half of the 20th century. You spent most of your career as a politician, but I would assume that your dad gave you lots of good advice along the way. Can you expound a bit on some of the learnings that he gave you from his distinguished career?
Well, I had a wonderful relationship with my father, and the several things that he said to me over the years that always had an impact. The first one is something that people may find funny, but my dad used to say to me, if you're going to give a talk, if you're going to be out there speaking, take the stage. Don't look down at your shoes. Don't pause or hesitate. Just talk. And luckily, I always had the gift of the gab from childhood. It didn't hold me back. But he just said, feel confident in yourself. If you don't have to do it, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. But if that's what you're going to do, do it. Then do it well. And the second thing he said was that there's a difference between saying things and proving things. You've got to be learning. And finally, he just said, and he's particularly talking to a very precocious young man. He said, you've got to learn how to listen and listen to what you're hearing from other people. And I've always remembered that now. Of course, my dad is long passed away, but particularly now in this job in New York, I really feel his presence is sort of all around me, and I feel very very lucky to be his son. My mom was a huge influence as well. She lived to be much older. She died when she was 100, and she was going strong until the very end, and had lots of advice from me when I was in politics. I think they would both be delighted that I'm been given the chance to do this job, because I think they felt that this was a natural thing for me to be doing. And I must confess, I feel very much at home here in New York, and very much at home at the United Nations.
Well, it's also a very nice culmination to your career, which was mainly political. And I think a lot of people, knowing your political history, would say you have been a victim of bad luck and bad timing through your political career. You were a socialist-leaning Premier of Ontario at a time when a major recession came in, 1990 to 91, which prevented your government from bringing in a number of social programs that you would have liked to do, but the money just wasn't in the coffers. And then you became later the interim leader of the National Liberal Party at a time when the Conservatives had a majority government. So you really didn't have the influence that you might have liked to have had. When you look back on your career, is it with disappointment and regret, or was it a pretty rewarding run?
No regrets at all. I mean, I know that what you have described, could make somebody say, gee, too bad. But I don't look back with regrets in the least. I feel I've been very, very lucky in so many ways. I've been lucky in my personal life and with my children and with Arlene, and everything has it's been amazing. And I find that when I look back at the number of things that I've been able to do, the political leadership, yes, of course, but helping to save the Toronto Symphony or working on the Myanmar file, really understanding better a refugee crisis and how to deal with it. I've had an incredible range of issues working in the far north with Indigenous groups. I just feel very, very blessed and have no regrets at all. And I'm glad you think that this is my culminating moment, but I don't feel the culmination's come yet. I'm still looking around. I'm still going strong. So
All right, well then, so let me ask this question. I was going to ask, would you have made a great prime minister? But let me put it this way: will you make a great prime minister one day?
Well, we have a prime minister who I'm delighted to serve. I have no idea whether that opportunity could or would arise, but I do feel that I've learned a lot. I think I got better as premier as time went on. I think it was hard at the beginning for me, and it was hard for everybody. But I found I got better and more comfortable with it. And I must confess that I think there's something to be said for experience in whatever you're doing. And it's all. I mean, I was used at many points in my career to being the youngest or the first. I was elected to Parliament when I was 30. I was leader of a party when I was 33. I was premier when I was 41. So you look back and say that's all very early. And then now, of course, people say, well, you're 73 now. So you say, well, yeah, but I feel good. My health is fine. So I feel very lucky to be able to contribute the way I can.
I want to ask you, before we come to a close, just your feelings about America today. I don't want to specifically pin you down to your feelings about the current president or the previous president, but I'm sure you'd agree that America is perhaps in a less happy state than it was through most of our lifetimes. What's your feeling about America, and, is democracy in trouble in the United States?
I do think that we are at a challenging moment in American history. I think that the push and pull of democracy has been very tough, and the degree of polarization has been very tough. I share the concern of a great many people, a great many Americans, about the fate of and the importance of American democracy. The one thing I can say here is as we speak, I've just come away from a lunch with the American ambassador here, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's a wonderful representative of the United States, a wonderful person. And I was reflecting after that conversation that I had with her, what a difference it has made to have an administration that actually believes in the United Nations, that's prepared to kind of help really make the UN work. We wouldn't have had a United Nations if it wasn't for the United States. If it wasn't for American leadership, the UN wouldn't exist in the form that it does exist. The final point I want to make is I actually have enormous confidence in the American people, and in the triumph of something I would simply call the American spirit, the ability of the United States to take things to the next level, the ability for them to reach out, and the way in which that relationship between our two countries is so significant and so important. So of course we're concerned. We're concerned about democracy everywhere, concerned about democracy in our own country, in Canada. But we have to be aware that there are some good people who are fighting the good fight on democracy, and I think we need to work very closely with them on that, and I hope that we can do that here at the UN and elsewhere. Certainly the UN is one of the great battlefields for the idea of democracy, and we're experiencing that every day.
That's a good segue into my last question, one I ask all guests on Canada Files. And it'll be interesting from your perspective now, having been at the UN for the last 2.5 years, but what does being Canadian mean to you?
For me, being a Canadian means having the world in me and feeling that I'm at home in the world. I really think our country is a special, special place because we've opened ourselves up to the world in such a significant way. In my lifetime, even more than ever before. And also because as a Canadian, and having grown up as an international kid, if you like, I feel so strongly that we are a country that should feel at home in the world, and we can work with all the people in the world in a way that doesn't impose on other people, but embraces them. So that spirit of being a Canadian is extremely meaningful and important to me.
Ambassador Rae, thank you so much for your time and for your service on behalf of our country at the United Nations. It's been great having you on Canada Files.
Thank you so much, Jim. Good to be with you, too.
Thanks. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time with another edition of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, as well as the following donors: Akito Investments, Inc., the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Ted and Alice Kernahan, David and Cheryl Carr, Philip B. Lind, the North Pine Foundation, Francis and Eleanor Shen, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.